I invite you to hear this morning's New Testament reading. I read from the book of James. I begin in the 3rd chapter, and I'll read into the 4th chapter through verse 3. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. These conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder, and you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Amen. Shankar Vedantam hosts a fascinating and just a little terrifying podcast on this topic of envy. You may know the name. He is sometimes heard on NPR, part of a podcast called The Hidden Brain, in which he talks to different social scientists about what's going on in our brain and the way our brains work. Oftentimes talking to social psychologists to say that how we engage with one another. He's done an entire podcast on this idea of envy. It's called Counting Other People's Blessings. And he talks about what it looks like to have this thing called envy inside of us. And he starts off on a positive note, actually. He says there's some good examples of envy. There are some things that envy can do to us that are actually positive things in our life. Good examples would include wanting to be a better person. For example, I could hear Reed Shinkle sing that song and say, man, if only I could sing like that. Man, there's a little envy there, right? But if that causes me to say, well, what if I go take some lessons? What if I practice? What if I learn a little bit? Maybe I don't get as good as Reed, but I could get better. I could be a little bit more like that. This is what Vedantam calls a benign envy. This is an envy that helps us to be maybe better people, to see, I want to aspire to that. I want to be inspired by that, as maybe some of us were by Reed singing this morning. That's a good example of envy. But it goes downhill from there. Envy in so many ways and in so many cases is not benign, but is much darker, leads us down darker roads and darker places, sometimes called malevolent envy, very different than this benign form, sometimes even hostile envy, he describes. He talks about kind of what that spiral down looks like. First of all, he talks about sports. He talks about the way that in sports we have this almost automatic envy of our rivals, people who are on the other team. And so a lot of times we have a team that's our favorite, and so the longtime rival of that, we don't like it when they do well. And so there have been studies shown that say that the bigger the fan, the more their brain kind of triggers happiness when something bad happens to the other team. They get an out or something happens, they get an interception, right? Our brains are happy about those moments because our rival, of whom we're envy, has done something wrong, right? And of course your preacher is far above such things. I've never even considered purchasing a shirt that says, I cheer for the Chicago Cubs and whoever is playing the St. Louis Cardinals. Never would have crossed my mind, right? But it does get darker than that. Even they've done some of these studies that say the higher the kind of vehemence of a fan, the more likely they are to cheer when a member of the opposing team gets injured. Even a season-ending injury, maybe even a career-ending injury still triggers that same happy moment in our brains, cheering the ill will of another. Vedantam also talks about politics, and how politics has started to have a similar dynamic. How once upon a time we would talk about politics in a way that said, well, we're all working toward the common good. We have different ideologies, different ways to do that, but we're all working for a better country, a better nation, a better community. But it seems less and less that is the case. Now it's always about us versus them. There are almost two different teams that we're fighting, one versus the other. And if the other team, has something bad happen to it, then we're happy. The envy over looking at a rival causes that same sense of malevolence, that same sense even of violence toward another, even to the point Vedantam shared historically how in the 70s when the Carter administration was dealing with the hostage situation in Iran. The longer that went on, of course, the more dangerous it was, the more deadly it became. But yet there were members of the opposing party, the Republicans, who were happy because that meant something that would go well for their political party, and maybe Reagan would get elected. And on the flip side, when we were watching the casualty numbers coming back from Iraq day after day, week after week, quietly there were some Democrats who cheered those numbers because it meant that, of course, their rival, George Bush, looked bad in the process, wishing violence upon another person, even death, because it helps our envy. Vedantam goes on to suggest that even in some of the darkest times and darkest places, envy rears its ugly head. He even points to the Holocaust. Historians will show that in the years prior to the Nazi reign, those that were in Europe saw a rise of a lot of prominent Jews. They were doing well financially, they were doing well in prestige. Meanwhile, the Germans were suffering under the results following retribution after World War I, and so they were suffering economically while these Jews were succeeding. Their rivals became a target of envy, and that envy turned to resentment. And that resentment turned to rage. Some of the most violent rage. Some people that would never, ever imagine being as violent as the ordinary Germans were, did unspeakable acts. That is the dark side of envy. And so as we compare ourselves to each other, this social comparison can have some positive impacts, but so often, so often it becomes malevolent, even violent. That's kind of the way that Vedantam talks about envy. He talks about this social comparison, kind of like a yardstick, right? We all probably have a couple of these or a dozen of these sitting around our house somewhere, right? And so on the yardstick of a life, we look down here about, well, how high do I rank, right? How high am I on this yardstick? Where do I fit? And then where do my rivals fit? Where do my neighbors fit? Maybe I'm here, but oh man, do you see that new car they got? Now they're up here. Maybe I need to get a new car too. Maybe I need to paint my house too. Maybe I need to make sure that my kids get into the right college, right? And so we kind of have these moments of prestige, these moments of envy, of saying, well, I want to be like that too. And so we put ourselves on the yardsticks of social comparison. And if we don't measure up in our own minds, if we don't get as high as maybe somebody next to us, those people then become the targets of our envy and possibly, quite possibly, even the targets of our wrath. Vedantam talks about the ways that oftentimes moving from envy to wishing ill will to another, to even being willing to cause that ill will, is a scary result of the social comparison game. Well, it is a game that is deep within us and something that we struggle with. That's why we call it a vice. We're in the middle of a series now about vices. These capital vices, sometimes called the 7 deadly sins. If you heard on Ash Wednesday, I preached about a comparison between those two words. What a vice is a vice is kind of a personality trait or a habit, kind of a character reality, sometimes called a flaw in our lives. We would call it in the series unholy habits, things that kind of are a part of our personality that then will cause an action, an activity, an event, a moment that is sin, right? And so a vice is a little bit different than a sin, but vices cause us to fall into that. And so we fall into these moments of treating each other with violence, of treating ourselves with violence, because we come out of this place in which these vices, we've talked about vainglory on Ash Wednesday. Moyne did an amazing job last week talking about the vice of lust and what that's about. And so today we talk about the vice of envy. What does envy do to bring us to that place of causing sin? Well, we're not the first to ask that question, and nor are we the first to find an answer. James speaks specifically about envy, speaks specifically about this vice in a way that helps us try to figure out what this is all about. Now, for James, it's a little bit tough to know kind of what's going on in the context of the book. You know, when we pick up Paul, we can know pretty quickly, here's written by Paul, written to the church at Corinth, for example, or to the church at Thessalonica. No, we see it. It's right there. We don't get that necessarily in James. We're not 100% sure who he's writing to. We don't know exactly what's going on in the church, but we could tell by the context. We could tell if we read the whole thing that this envy that he speaks of is causing some significant problems in the church. So what it's doing is it's causing these broken relationships. It's causing the social comparison game to rear its ugly head, right? So there are people that tend to be richer than others in every community, and so when they would walk into the church that James was writing to, if they were rich, if they were well off, then people would go trip over themselves to say, "Oh, here, have this seat of honor. Why don't you sit here? Why don't you be in the front here where everybody can see you and look how prestigious you are?" If somebody was poor and came into that same church, they said, "Hey, why don't you sit on the floor in the back? We don't really care if you're here or not," right? And so there's this social comparison between who was really valued and who wasn't. And so when somebody didn't get quite the honor that they expected or that they wanted, they went out of their way to kind of go behind people's backs and whisper about them and create this division, create this distraction. They would talk badly about people, gossip about people. They would kind of create these separations within the church itself. That's what we read from the context. That's what James seems to be saying to those that are within this church. Now, we don't know exactly what one church he's writing to, and there's a very good possibility he wasn't writing to one church, but he was writing to any church, right? I mean, it's kind of one of these general things that a lot of churches have gone through, right? So he's maybe even writing to the church of all y'all, right? All of us. Everybody can see that in their own congregations to see what is happening when envy rears its ugly head and the social comparison game brings a brokenness. This is what's happening in James. And so he understands this difference, right, between a vice and a sin. He doesn't use that language, but he talks about the fact that for some of us, we have this inclination, and what are we going to do with it? Are we going to take this inclination and are we going to allow it to divide? Are we going to allow it to separate us? Are we going to allow it to do these things, to compare, to set somebody high on the pedestal and somebody low at the bottom? Will we start to live that way because of envy, because we want to create this social comparison? James sees what's happening in these churches and he goes ballistic. Listen again to some of these words. He says, "If you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be boastful and false to the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there's envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind," he says. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? Kind of this idea of a vice, right? You want something and you do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something, you cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. He goes on to say, I didn't read into verse 4, he says, "Adulterers, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God?" He doesn't hold back. This is angry James, angry at what is happening with envy in the church that he writes to, broken-hearted at the way that they are causing division, the way that they're separating one another, and they're attacking and distracting from the good word of the gospel. He is angry in his heart. And yet, there's another James that also writes in this book. There is an angry James, but there is also a gentle James. a peaceable James. A James that speaks of purity, of unity, of hope, of bringing together instead of pulling apart. This is the James that we read about in the book of Acts. Barbara Brown Taylor reminds us that, remember in Acts it was James that when Paul came back wanting to convert the Gentiles and work with them and do ministry with them, and Peter saying, whoa, wait a minute, you can't do it that way. And they were at each other's throats. Who stood in the middle? Who stood between them? It was James. He offered a compromise, brokered a truce between them. Later on, helped to find a way that Paul could bring his Gentile converts into the church, to bring and open and create bridges instead of divisions. This is gentle James. This is the James that comes to speak a different word. Again, it's Taylor that reminds us the words that he says, these are words that are beautiful, that are powerful. She says that Paul and James could sing a duet together. If you imagine the words of 1 Corinthians 13 in which he extols love, hear now again these words from James. The wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy, and a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace for those who make peace. Who is wise and understanding among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. It was Martin Luther who suggested, he hated the book of James. He said the book of James shouldn't even be in the Bible. He called it the epistle of straw. Should throw the whole thing out of the Bible even, because he didn't talk enough, James in his mind at least, didn't talk enough about the cross, he didn't talk enough about Jesus, and he didn't talk enough about grace. But here in James, we see a very different description of grace. For him, wisdom, the way of wisdom is grace. It's a better way of living than divisions and social comparisons and violence and disunity, which we get, right? We can understand that. We can see in our own lives, and how many of us have been a part of churches and other places and other times that have gone through this very thing, that have had somebody who decided that they didn't have quite enough power, that they weren't quite in charge enough, and so they got the little power that they had, and they went around in the hallway conversations, they went around and they told gossip about people, and they went around and they created disunity, and they created problems and distractions within the church. I could tell some horror stories of how I've seen exactly what James is talking about happen in churches that I've been a part of. It hurts, says James. It hurts, and he doesn't want to see that happen. And so gentle James, peaceable James says there's a better way. There's a better way than living by that envy, than living by the way of brokenness, of comparing ourselves and saying, I'm not as good as you, so I'm going to knock you down a peg or two until I am. It's simply a broken way to be Christian and a broken way to be church. And so gentle James and peaceable James tries his best to speak this way of wisdom. He talks about it later about the way of wisdom is like friendship with God. Understanding that the way that God sees us, that's the way that we must see ourselves, which is echoed in a book by Rebecca Kynendijk the Young. She writes this book, actually it's been an inspiration for this series. I'm doing it in a book group together, and as we study this book called Glittering Vices, she does this important job of kind of contemporizing some of the ways that we talk about these vices, both grounding it in ancient times and then also saying, what does this look like today in our world? And so she talks about all these different vices and talks about envy and talks about what envy is all about. And she says the same thing that James does. She doesn't use this language of wisdom, but it compares. It's very similar in what she's trying to talk about. She says, when we begin to fight back against envy, when we try to empty ourselves from that envy and try to look for a remedy, an antidote to it, she said we have to change the way we think. Look at this quote. This is the way she describes it. She says this: If envy is a loser's game, it is a game that we are doomed to lose even if we win. For to win at envy is to destroy the possibility of love between oneself and others and oneself and God. It destroys that horizontal relationship and that vertical relationship. To be envious is to be determined to live in a way that precludes gratitude and contentment, love and happiness. Relationships of love are the only thing that will truly make us happy. The envious thus pursue happiness in a way that necessarily undermine their chances of having it. Let me read that one again. The envious thus pursue happiness in a way that necessarily undermines their chances of having it. The only escape from this vice is to find a completely different foundation for our self-worth. Envy depends on a comparative self-value. In other words, envy is about the yardstick of life. And the only escape from this vice is to find a completely different foundation for our self-worth. To understand that we must see ourselves the way that God sees us, not the way we stack up here in the social comparison game, not the way that we look across the street or even at the pew next to us and say, well, am I as good as that person? Am I as special? Am I as rich? Am I as powerful? But instead, asking the question, how does God see me? Who am I in God's eyes? How do I get my self-worth from above? That is the way of wisdom. So we remember the title of Shankar Vedantam's podcast, right? Counting other people's blessings, right? And you know where it comes from, right? You know where the title comes from. There's a famous hymn, right, that he's referring to in the midst of. You all know what this is? Count your many blessings, right? Name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done, right? It's a wonderful hymn, kind of a wonderful sentiment, and it's completely wrong when it comes to envy. Because if you count your blessings and live a life of envy, you will always find that your neighbor has one more. Just one more, or just two, or maybe 10. No. With apologies to Johnson Oatman Jr., who wrote Count Your Many Blessings all those many years ago. It's a great hymn, but it doesn't teach us how we respond to the life of envy. Instead, we simply have to stop counting. We have to stop counting where we are good and where we are evil. We have to stop counting where we are worthwhile and where we are not. We have to stop using the yardstick of life and throw it away. Starting over with a new definition of who we are. A new definition of self-worth, a new definition of wisdom, a new definition of love given by God. That is the word that we speak to one another as we come into this place. That is the word that God speaks to us. Don't use the yardstick. Stop counting. Another hymn that perhaps is more helpful in the context of envy comes from, a few years later. Actually, it's been 70 years now since Gloria Gaither wrote the words that you'll find in our hymnal on page 680. I then shall live. Words that help to remind us of what our relative self-worth is all about. Who decides who makes us worthwhile? She writes these words, I then shall live as one who's been forgiven. I'll walk with joy to know my debts are paid. I know my name is clear before my Father. I am his child, and I am not afraid. So greatly pardoned, all forgive another. The law of love I gladly will obey. I then shall live as one who's learned compassion. I've been so loved, I'll risk loving too. I know how fear builds walls instead of bridges. I dare to see another's point of view. And when relationships demand a commitment, I'll be there to care and follow through. Your kingdom come around and through and in me. Your power and glory, let them shine through me. Your hallowed name, oh, may I bear with honor, and may your living kingdom come in me. The bread of life, oh, may I share with honor, and may you feed a hungry world through me. May this be the reminder that you are loved, that you are valued, that you are worthy, regardless of what the yardstick of social comparison of the world says. There is a wisdom that teaches a better way, not the way of envy, the way of love, and the way of worth. Today and every day, may we come to this place to be reminded of that love, and may we go from this place to teach that love and feed a hungry world through us.